Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1987 film Stakeout. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on this film, I want to give a special shout out to David for requesting this review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, check out the link down below in the video description, and I will try to get to it as soon as I possibly can. Now, Stakeout is one of those films that, for whatever reason, despite the fact that it got some good reviews and it was a pretty decent hit in the box office in 1987, it's kind of fallen in between the cracks. It only got an official release on DVD. This Blu-ray is an unofficial release. This is not an official release by Touchstone or Disney or Kino Lorber or any other company. And you don't really see a whole lot of people talking about this movie anymore. And on one hand, I think part of it is there are a couple sequences and there are a couple things about this movie that I think a lot of people nowadays are going to find triggering for whatever reason. But another part of it is just the fact that it's a movie that deals with a very formulaic plot. And despite the fact that it's a film that executes a lot of these elements really well and has a genuine amount of things going for it, the formulaic plot and just the kind of movie that it is, it's just really easy for a film like this to kind of fall in between the cracks over the years. And I'm hoping, though, that through some kind of way, this film winds up getting a little more recognition because it's a really fun, enjoyable movie. I have a few issues with it. Mainly, I think the romance angle, it's okay, but I think it drags on a bit too long. There's a certain character in the film that I think is kind of inconsequential and unneeded, and the focus on that character kind of drags the film down a bit too. And also, I would have liked to have seen like a couple more bits of action, because other than the sequence at the paper mill, none of the action in this is really that memorable or that thrilling compared to other action comedy hybrids. So I think that's something that's missing from this movie as well. But all of that being said, it's still a enjoyable, entertaining movie and a fun watch. It's directed by John Badham, who prior to this he did a bunch of things, including Blue Thunder. And at this point in his career, he was an established veteran in the film industry, and it definitely does show here. His direction is very solid, very capable, very competent. There's a lot of skill behind the camera, and it's very evident when it comes to even like the opening sequence, the prison break, or some of the other sequences in the film that have a more dreamlike, nightmarish sort of quality to them. Uh, the scene in the paper mill, in particular, I thought that was a sequence that was really well shot because there's a lot of things going on in front of the camera in that sequence. There's a lot of things moving. There's a lot of hiding in tight spaces. There's a lot of potential pitfalls for a director in that sequence, and John Badham never really ran into a single one of them. And I also feel that for this kind of movie, he was definitely a good director, a good pick for this kind of film, because he was always a guy who could direct in a way where you could have some goofy, silly shenanigans and, one-liners and stuff, but then you would have like serious, tense moments that would be just as effective as any of the other comedic sequences, because of the fact that he was so good at balancing tone as well as just directing in general. I think John Badham is a really good director, and if in a lot of ways, especially nowadays, kind of underrated because you don't really hear John Badham's name that much. when people are talking about really accomplished, skilled directors, and I think John Badham, he should be in that category. I mean, he did Saturday Night Fever, he did Dracula from 1979, he did Blue Thunder, he did War Games, he did Short Circuit. So he did the hard way with Michael J. Fox and James Woods. He also did Bird on a Wire with Mel Gibson. I mean, even something like Point of No Return or Drop Zone or Nick of Time, like he's had a really consistent career for the most part in terms of quality films in the action genre as well as in other genres. So yeah, I think John Badham is an underrated name when it comes to Hollywood directors. And then you have the screenplay by Jim Koof. Now, I don't think the script is as consistently great as John Badham's direction is for the most part with this movie, but it's still a good screenplay. It takes a very simple plot of these two cops who are on a stakeout and makes it into something that's a really enjoyable, fun romp. Despite the fact that there are some moments where it genuinely could be improved upon. Um, but it's just still one of those movies where it just has a good vibe to it, and it has a lot of opportunities for the two leads, Bill and Chris, these two detectives, to really shine and play off of one another. And it makes for a very entertaining watch. It really does. Now, the plot, despite the fact that it has some moments where the romance is rather charming between Maria and Chris, I think that goes on a bit too long and kind of drags the film out a bit too much. It's one of those things where when it starts focusing on those scenes exclusively, the film kind of stops a little bit and kind of becomes more of like a rom-com, and it really starts becoming more of a Richard Dreyfuss vehicle where he is the one that's infatuated with the woman that he's staking out, and it leaves Emilio Estevez's character Bill on the sideline. And I think this film is at its best when those two are together and they're poking fun at one another and they're fucking with each other and they're getting involved in action sequences. That's where I honestly feel the film is at its best. And I just feel that it's not at that point as much as it really should be. It's at that point a good amount of the running time, but there is a certain point where it's focusing more on Chris and his romantic involvement with Maria. And there's other moments where things just aren't as consistent in terms of the way that it portrays or deals with certain characters. For instance, the escaped convict who escapes at the beginning of the film, Richard, he has this partner in crime named Reese, and this character just feels very inconsequential and unneeded. You could have that character be there in the beginning of the movie, but I don't really feel he needed to be in the film for the rest of the running time until his character eventually dies in a river, because this character was just a nothing character. There's no reason to care about this guy. I think they tried to make you care about him or sympathize with him because he was one of those convicts or criminals that was just going along for the ride, but didn't want to shoot the cops or didn't want to go as far as Richard was gonna go with things, but he still went along with it anyway. So it's not like he actually had that strong of a conviction. So even on that front, it was kind of weak. So yeah, I don't really think that whole character in his scenes were needed at all. Just kind of added to the running time, and the film was already a little bit too long to begin with. I mean, I like the film and I enjoy it, but it didn't need to be nearly 2 hours. Like that just was not the running time that a film like this really needed to tell its story. But despite some of those issues, like there are some really great moments in this. The opening sequence with the escape at the prison, I thought that was a different way to open up a film, especially a film like this that's more of a buddy cop comedy with bits of action. Speaking of the action, I know it's more of a buddy cop comedy, but I would have liked to have seen at least a couple more action sequences, maybe a more extended chase at some point in the movie. I know there's one near the end. That's when Richard's car winds up in the river because the cops are chasing after him. But I mean like a chase involving the two leads, or maybe another gunfight or something, or a little bit more than what you ultimately got, because there were a lot of moments where it really did focus a lot on the romance, and I just didn't really feel that was as effective as any of the action moments or the sequences featuring Bill and Chris on the stakeout. Speaking of Bill and Chris on the stakeout, I love a lot of the sequences where they're just alone together and just trying to find ways to entertain one another. There's a great moment when they're doing a trivia game and they're playing this game of like guess which movie quote I'm saying, and Bill says to Chris a quote from Jaws, and Chris has no idea what film it's from. That got me so hard when I first saw that scene. I laughed my ass off at that sequence. And apparently that was improvised because before they started shooting certain scenes, they would have a bit of a layoff so the cast and crew would play games. And one of the games was Guess That Quote. And they actually played a game where Emilio Estevez, who plays the character Bill, he actually said that exact quote from Jaws to Richard Dreyfuss, and Richard had no idea what film the quote was from. And they decided to just put that into the movie. And I thought that was just hilarious. There's other fun lines like when uh, Chris is talking about how the house reminds him of uh, Jason Voorhees, uh, which I thought was hilarious too. I did not expect that kind of line to be said in Stakeout of all movies, a movie released by Touchstone. I wasn't expecting a Friday the 13th reference. Looks like we're staying in Jason's house tonight. I don't think that's the exact line of dialogue, but it's something along those lines, and I thought that was pretty clever. And even little stuff like when they are chasing after this perp in a fish market. I think that's a fun concept and it's ripe for a lot of humor, and there's a fair amount of that even sets itself up rather well in the office of the detective's boss, the chief, who is not too happy about them smelling like a fish market, and they don't even want. He doesn't even want them to sit in his chair, but Richard Dreyfuss's character still messes with him. So when the chief is looking away, he just rubs his butt real quick on the chair. I thought that was funny. And speaking of funny, moments. I really like the prank war that Chris and Bill have with the other detectives who are on the stakeout, who are doing the stakeout in the morning. They have this back and forth prank war with one another, which I felt was a nice way to provide some levity to the film, because there are some moments where it's a little it's a little intense in terms of what's going on with Richard and him trying to get to Maria's house, and there's even some nightmare scenes that are pretty pretty effective in terms of their intensity. And then, of course, you have a rather memorable and strong climax in the paper mill. I love that sequence. I think it's an inspired setting for the climax of a movie in a paper mill. And I think that's rather good. Even the stuff prior to that, when um, the characters are cornered by Richard, and even some of the romance stuff is still good. Like I like the initial first date that Chris and Maria have because it has this fun back and forth between Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez, where Richard Dreyfuss is having a dinner date with Maria while poor Bill is just suffering and freezing his butt off in this dilapidated house across the street, and he's hungry, he's cold, he's hungry, he's pissed off. His partner and friend is like having a nice warm dinner and looks like he's gonna get some poontang, and he's just gonna be by himself, and he's not even gonna get his damn donuts. So like that works. And so do moments when you find out that uh Chris had an ex who left him, and she went to the extreme when it comes to taking stuff during the breakup, and even stole his damn blinds so he can't even sleep. So it's one of those things where there are definitely some prime moments of hilarity and comedy and fun in this script. Even the perp that they chased through the fish market, he happens to also be somewhat associated with Richard. So then it leads to a full circle moment, which I thought was fun as well. Now, there is an elephant in the room. It's that one sequence where Chris acts like a pervy old man and spies on Maria in the shower. Yeah, I don't think that scene was needed. I'm not as offended by the scene as other people are, because it's just one of those things where times were different back then, and this wasn't necessarily considered to be something that was off limits. But still, it really it really is just there for sex appeal, and it's one of those things where you have enough of that as is. I don't think you lose anything by cutting that scene out, to be perfectly honest. But I don't think it really hurts the overall enjoyment of the movie either, having that scene in, because it's so inconsequential to the plot. And at the end of the day, I mean, Richard Dreyfuss's character winds up getting the girl anyway, so it's not like it's one of those things where he's winds up forcing himself on her against her will later on in the movie, or anything of that sort. So it's just one of those things where he's being a cheeky, randy old man, and it's kind of, it's there for sex appeal and maybe for some awkward laughs, but and also maybe for a little bit of tension, because like, oh my god, what is he doing? Like, you're gonna get caught, dude. And then he doesn't get caught, and then he's like winking at the audience, kind of thing. So I get why that scene is in the film, but it's one of those things where, yeah, it kind of is the elephant in the room nowadays, but it's still one of those things where it's like, I've seen worse in other films in the past, and this is one of those things where it doesn't bother me a whole lot. But I did want to mention it, and despite the fact that it doesn't bother me a whole lot, it didn't really need to be in the movie, and really, the film might have benefited from just cutting that out anyway, because it's an okay sequence, but it just kind of, the film kind of stops for that moment where it's like, oh, Chris is like, oh, I'm gonna take a peek, and that's really all that scene is. Um, but yeah, still, I like the script. I wasn't the only one. Jim Coof actually won some awards for this script, so it definitely did leave an impression, at least at the time. And You got other things about this film that are definitely up there when it comes to quality. One of them is the cast. I think Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez as the two leads are fantastic. I think the two of them have just amazing chemistry. They work so well off one another, and in a lot of ways, it is a very odd pairing. You have Richard Dreyfuss, who isn't normally cast in these kind of films, and then you have a young, up and coming star in Emilio Estevez. And you would think that maybe the two would clash, but no, they just fit together really well in this movie. And they're a big reason why the movie works. I would say arguably the biggest reason the movie works is because of how well the two of them uh, connect with one another, how great their scenes are, and just how infectious a lot of things are with these two characters. Their their natural chemistry. Aidian Quinn plays the villain, I guess if you want to call him that, the escaped convict, Richard Stick Montgomery. I know initially this character was going to be played by Val Kilmer, and Aidian Quinn is fine, but his performance is just kind of middle of the road. But that's kind of the way the character is. But I honestly would have loved to have seen Val Kilmer because he has a certain on-screen presence that I don't really feel Aidian Quinn has, and on top of that, a little bit more charisma. And it would have been really cool to have seen Val Kilmer play a villain at this point in his career, and play off of Emilio Estevez and Richard Dreyfuss. But Aidan Quinn was still fine. And then you have the film's third star, Madeline Stowe, who prior to this movie, she was in like an independent film that not very many people watched, and she was out of work in the industry for a good amount of time, and until she got her shot with Stakeout, and it wound up becoming a breakout role for her. And you can see why. She's got some great romantic chemistry with Richard Dreyfuss. She's got a certain fire to her that is really enjoyable, and something that definitely makes her stand out. And she really showed that she was a very capable performer, and she held her own against Dreyfuss, who at the time was a, a kind of a falling star a little bit. Like his star wasn't as bright as it might have been in the 70s or even in the early 80s, but he was still a relative big name, a guy who was well known in the industry, and she still stood toe to toe with him during the scenes with the two, and never seemed intimidated, never seemed like she was unable to handle the challenge. And you would see that later on in her career when she would go on to get other roles and make even more of an impact in the industry. One thing about her that I didn't quite know until I did a little bit of research is that she's actually half Costa Rican. Like she actually has uh, um, some Latin blood in her. Like she has a Latin heritage, and I did not know that at all. So it's one of those things where something that I felt was kind of off in the casting with her is now not even remotely the case, because she clearly does have Latin heritage. She is what you would call Latina. So it's one of those things where the casting worked, and I'm glad that she ultimately was able to get a spotlight put on her talents as an actress with this film, because without this movie, she probably would not have gone on to have the career that she ultimately wound up having, because she had been out of work for so long. She hadn't been in a major movie in years. So it's one of those things where she was a late bloomer, but she definitely wound up having a really effective, really strong career. And it started with Stakeout. But yeah, you also have Forrest Whitaker, who plays one of the detectives, along with Dan Lauria, who plays the other detective. You have the captain, not the chief, my bad, the captain, Al, played by Earl Billings, who I really loved his scenes, especially the scene where he's talking about putting balls into a paper shredder. I think that's what at least I think that's what the line was. And Ian Tracy, not really much of a performance, not really that great of an actor. He didn't do a ton of stuff, and you could kind of see why. Um, it seems like he did a lot of like TV, a lot of TV, and a lot of like extra work or like little bit parts and other things. Then you have this other guy, Jackson Davies, who plays FBI agent Thomas Lusk. There's a few other actors and actresses, but that's kind of really the main cast. And then there are some other things worth mentioning when it comes to the production. It's got some nice looking cinematography by John Seal. It's definitely a film that has this slick look to it. Uh, you have some good editing by Michael Rips and Tom Wolfe. I mean Tom Rolfe. My bad. And then you have a good score by Arthur B. Rubinstein. I thought it fit the film really well. It added an extra vibe to the movie, uh, made it have a certain feel that I definitely feel the filmmakers were trying to go for. And some of the bits of the score were rather catchy. Not as catchy, though, as the Mr. Mister song that was on the soundtrack, Is It Love? Which is, in my opinion, one of Mr. Mister's best songs. So that's a fun track, and another film that another aspect of the film, my bad, that definitely does fit the film well. And it's like 117 minutes, which that's a little bit too long. I think this really only needed to be like an hour and a half, hour 40, not clocking in at nearly 2 hours. But it still goes by at a decent enough pace because you're enjoying the company of Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez. So yeah, that is my thoughts on Stakeout. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. See ya.